Imagine walking through corridors where the fluorescent lights never turn off, where the sound of 8,000 people breathing creates a hum that vibrates through concrete walls 8 inches thick. Imagine a place so large it has its own zip code, so isolated that most Chicago residents drive past it daily without knowing they're passing one of the largest detention facilities on Earth. This is the Cook County Jail Complex. Built in 1978 for $72 million, that's over $300 million in today's money, it was designed to house 4,000 people temporarily. Today, it warehouses 9,000 human beings indefinitely, making it the largest mental health facility in the United States. But it's still run like a prison. The architects promised efficiency. Politicians promised reform. What they delivered was a machine that processes people like inventory, where suicide attempts cluster around 3 in the morning, where winter temperatures turn cells into concrete ovens, and where the most dangerous criminals are often the least violent. They're just too poor, too sick, or too mentally ill to exist anywhere else. For over 2 decades, this story remained buried in federal court documents, incident reports that nobody read, and medical files that documented preventable suffering with clinical precision. Today, we're opening those files. We're walking through those corridors. We're uncovering how America's promise to build humane corrections created something far more sinister. A warehouse for human beings that society decided it couldn't fix. This is the story of what happens when efficiency becomes cruelty, when architecture becomes punishment, and when the most vulnerable people in our society disappear into a system designed to forget them. Welcome to the forensic examination of America's largest forgotten tragedy. The wind cuts across Chicago's near west side like a blade drawn from Lake Michigan, carrying with it the scent of diesel exhaust and something else, something harder to name. It sweeps over 26 acres of asphalt and concrete that most drivers never really see, though they pass it every day on their way to work, to dinner, to lives that unfold in the warmth of unlocked rooms. This is the Cook County Jail Complex. At any given moment, it holds more human beings than many American towns. Its perimeter stretches longer than some city blocks are wide. Its walls contain enough concrete to build a small neighborhood, enough steel to frame a dozen office towers. But those numbers, impressive as they are, tell only part of the story. The real story begins not with what was built here, but with what was chosen to be forgotten. Most people driving past see only a series of low, beige buildings set back from the street, institutional and forgettable. They might notice the razor wire catching sunlight, the guard towers that never seem to have anyone in them, the parking lots filled with white vans and police cruisers. But the sheer scale of the place, the fact that behind those unremarkable walls lies one of the largest detention facilities on Earth, this somehow escapes notice. Perhaps because the mind struggles to comprehend such enormity. Perhaps because we have learned not to see what we cannot bear to acknowledge. The complex sprawls across what was once prairie, then farmland, then the kind of urban wasteland that cities accumulate like scar tissue. Rail lines run along its eastern edge, carrying freight trains that blow their horns at all hours, a sound that mingles with the sirens and the mechanical hum of ventilation systems that never stop running. To the south and west, the neighborhoods thin out into light industry and vacant lots, where weeds grow through chain link and broken glass, catches the light like fallen stars. This land has always been where Chicago sends what it cannot solve. Long before the first concrete was poured, before the first blueprint was drawn, this corner of the near west side served as the city's designated place of containment. In the late 1800s, it housed the Cook County Hospital for the Insane, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings where the mentally ill were warehoused in conditions that would later be deemed medieval. Before that, during the city's earliest years, it was home to the county poor farm, where the destitute and the vagrant were sent to work the soil in exchange for shelter and thin soup. Even earlier, when Chicago was little more than a trading post on the edge of a swamp, this area served as a potter's field, a burial ground for the anonymous dead, the immigrants who died in tenements, the workers who fell from construction sites, the women who bled out in back alley surgeries. Their bones still rest beneath the asphalt, mixed with the clay and sand that form the foundation of what would become one of America's most notorious jails. The pattern was established early. This land would be where the city deposited its unwanted. Not its criminals necessarily, but its inconveniences. The poor who had no relatives to claim them, the sick who had no money for private treatment, the mad who disrupted the orderly flow of commerce. Over the decades the buildings changed. Red brick gave way to concrete, open wards to individual cells, poor farms to processing centers, but the essential function remained the same. This was where Chicago sent people to be forgotten. By the 1970s, the old county jail had become a Victorian relic, its narrow corridors and antiquated plumbing no longer adequate for a city whose crime rates seemed to climb with each passing year. Gang violence was spreading beyond the traditional boundaries of poverty. Drug trafficking was becoming more organized, more violent. The courts were processing more defendants than ever before, and the old jail simply could not hold them all. The solution, when it came, followed the logic of American problem-solving in that era. Bigger was better. If the old jail was too small, the new one would be massive. If the old one was inefficient, the new one would be a marvel of modern corrections technology. If the old one looked like a prison, the new one would look like progress. The plans called for a facility that could house 8,000 inmates, more than the population of many small cities. It would be divided into multiple divisions, each self-contained, each capable of operating independently during emergencies. There would be medical facilities, educational programs, vocational training, religious services. The complex would be a city within a city, complete with its own power plant, its own kitchen capable of preparing thousands of meals per day, its own laundry that could process tons of clothing and bedding. The politicians who championed the project spoke of efficiency and economy. They presented charts showing the cost per bed, the reduction in transportation expenses, the savings from centralized services. They talked about rehabilitation and reintegration, about giving offenders the tools they needed to become productive citizens. But beneath the rhetoric about reform and renewal lay a simpler calculus. The jail would be judged not by how many people it helped, but by how many people it could hold. Construction began in the spring of 1975. The old buildings were demolished first, their red brick facades crumbling under the weight of wrecking balls, their ornate cornices and arched windows disappearing into dumpsters bound for landfills. For months, the site was nothing but churned earth and the skeletal frames of cranes reaching toward an empty sky. The concrete came next, thousands of cubic yards of it, poured in sections that would form the walls, the floors, the ceilings of what would become home to thousands of people. The walls were specified to be 8 inches thick in most areas, 12 inches in high-security zones. Thick enough to muffle sound, the architects claimed, though they had never tested what 8 inches of concrete could actually accomplish against the accumulated noise of 8,000 people confined in close quarters. The steel followed the concrete, millions of pounds of reinforcement bar, window frames, door hinges, lock mechanisms. The doors themselves were works of industrial art, solid steel slabs that weighed hundreds of pounds each, fitted with windows no larger than a sheet of paper, operated by keys that guards would wear on rings that grew heavier with each additional responsibility. The corridors were designed for movement, not lingering, wide enough for 2 guards to walk side by side, long enough to maintain clear sight lines, sterile enough to be hosed down with industrial disinfectant. The architects had studied the flow patterns of other large institutions, airports, hospitals, shopping malls, and had concluded that people moved most efficiently through spaces that offered no invitation to pause, no comfortable places to gather, no visual distractions to slow the pace of transit. The cells themselves were marvels of spatial efficiency. 8 feet by 10 feet, just large enough for a narrow bunk, a small desk, a combination toilet and sink unit made of polished steel that could not be broken or turned into a weapon. A single window, 6 inches wide and 18 inches tall, offered a view of either another building or a small courtyard where nothing grew. The windows could not be opened. The air came through vents controlled by a central system that would run 24 hours a day for the next 4 decades. Each division was designed to house between 400 and 800 people, depending on the security level and the configuration of the cells. The divisions would be named with letters and numbers: Division 1, Division 5, Division 9. The people housed within them would be identified by numbers as well: booking numbers, medical record numbers, court case numbers. The architecture itself seemed to resist the accumulation of individual identity, as if the building's fundamental purpose was not just to contain bodies, but to reduce them to their most basic administrative components. The visiting areas were placed at the perimeter of the complex, connected to the housing units by a maze of corridors and checkpoints. Visitors would enter through metal detectors, pass through multiple locked doors, and finally arrive at rooms filled with small tables and plastic chairs. The visits would be limited to 30 minutes, monitored by guards, conducted under fluorescent lights that drained the color from everything they touched. The medical facilities were designed as an afterthought, tucked into corners of the complex where they would not interfere with the primary functions of housing and security. There would be examination rooms, a small pharmacy, a dental clinic, and a few beds for inmates who were too sick to remain in the general population, but not sick enough to warrant transport to a hospital. The medical staff would be small, the equipment basic, the expectation being that serious health problems would be handled elsewhere. Mental health received even less consideration. There would be a few offices for counselors, a small area that could be used for group therapy, and a handful of isolation cells for inmates who became too disruptive for the general population. The planners seemed to assume that mental illness would be a minor issue, easily managed by the same staff and systems that handled everything else. In June of 1978, the first phase of the Cook County Jail complex opened its doors. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by the mayor, the county board president, the sheriff, and several judges who would soon be sending defendants to fill the new cells. They posed for photographs in the pristine corridors, their shoes echoing off floors that had not yet been scuffed by the passage of thousands of feet. The press coverage was uniformly positive. Editorial writers praised the facility as a model of modern corrections, a humane alternative to the overcrowded and decrepit jails of the past. They noted the spacious visiting areas, the modern medical facilities, the educational and vocational programs that would help inmates prepare for their return to society. They compared it favorably to jails in other major cities, noting its efficiency and economy. What the press did not report, because no one yet understood it, was that the jail had been designed around a fundamental miscalculation. The architects and planners had assumed that the people sent to Cook County would be there temporarily, a few weeks, perhaps a few months, while they awaited trial or served short sentences. They had designed the facility for rapid turnover, constant movement, the efficient processing of bodies through a system that would return them to the outside world as quickly as possible. But the reality of American justice in the late 20th century was quite different. Pretrial detention was becoming longer as court dockets became more crowded. Sentences were becoming harsher as politicians competed to appear tough on crime. And increasingly, the people being sent to jail were not just accused criminals, but individuals whose primary offense was being too poor to afford bail, too mentally ill to navigate the court system, or too addicted to drugs or alcohol to function in the outside world. The jail had been built for efficiency, but efficiency assumed a kind of predictability that the American justice system could no longer provide. It had been built for temporary housing, but it would soon become home to people who would spend years within its walls. Most significantly, it had been built as a place of detention, but it would quickly become something else entirely: the largest provider of mental health services in the state of Illinois. This transformation began almost immediately. Within the first year of operation, guards reported that a significant percentage of new arrivals appeared to be suffering from mental illness. Some were actively psychotic, hearing voices or believing that they were being persecuted by invisible enemies. Others were severely depressed, refusing to eat or speak for days at a time. Still others were manic, talking rapidly, sleeping little, making grandiose plans that bore no relation to their circumstances. The jail's medical staff, trained primarily in treating injuries and managing chronic conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure, found themselves overwhelmed by demands for psychiatric care. The few mental health professionals on staff could see only a fraction of the inmates who needed attention. Waiting lists grew longer each week, crises mounted. The correctional officers, meanwhile, found themselves serving as de facto mental health workers, tasked with managing behavior they did not understand and had not been trained to handle. They learned through trial and error which inmates could be reasoned with and which required constant supervision. They developed informal protocols for dealing with suicide attempts, psychotic episodes, and the kind of profound despair that comes from being confined in a small space with no clear prospect of release. By 1980, just 2 years after the jail opened, it was clear that the facility was not functioning as intended. The clean lines and efficient corridors that had impressed visitors during the opening ceremony were now crowded and chaotic. The educational and vocational programs that had been touted in the press had been scaled back to make room for more beds. The medical facilities that had seemed adequate during the planning phase were stretched beyond their capacity. But the most significant change was invisible to casual observers. The jail had quietly transformed from a place of temporary detention into something unprecedented in American history, a massive mental health facility operating within the framework of a correctional institution. Thousands of people with serious mental illnesses were being housed in a building designed for security, not treatment. They were being managed by staff trained in law enforcement, not healthcare. They were being medicated by doctors who saw them for minutes rather than hours, diagnosed by professionals who had no access to their medical histories, treated with whatever pharmaceuticals happened to be available in the jail's limited formulary. The consequences of this transformation would not become fully apparent for years. They would emerge slowly, in lawsuit after lawsuit documenting inadequate care and preventable deaths. They would surface in federal investigations that revealed systemic failures and constitutional violations. They would manifest in the stories of individuals who entered the jail with manageable mental health conditions and left with trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. But in 1980, those consequences were still in the future. What was visible then was simply a very large jail that seemed to be operating at capacity almost from the moment it opened. The politicians who had championed its construction declared it a success. The administrators who ran it spoke confidently about its efficiency and economy. The public, which had demanded a solution to rising crime rates, seemed satisfied that something was being done. None of them understood yet that they had created a machine whose purpose would gradually shift from what they intended to something they had never imagined. They had set out to build a place of temporary detention, and had instead constructed what would become the largest mental health facility in the United States. They had designed a system for processing criminals and had created an institution that would house thousands of people whose primary offense was being poor, sick, or unlucky enough to encounter a police officer during a mental health crisis. The machine was running exactly as it had been designed to run. That was the problem. 17. 19. The machine never sleeps. At 3 a.m, when the city outside settles into the brief quiet that comes before dawn, the Cook County Jail complex hums with the relentless rhythm of institutional life. Fluorescent lights burn in corridors that stretch for what seems like miles. Guards move through their rounds with keys that jangle like wind chimes in the artificial stillness. Somewhere in the vast network of cells and common areas, someone is always awake, pacing, thinking, waiting for morning to bring another day identical to the one before. The schedule governs everything. 4:30 in the morning, wake-up call echoes through the divisions, a metallic announcement that bounces off concrete walls and steel doors before settling into the consciousness of 8,000 people who have no choice but to listen. 5 o'clock. Breakfast preparation begins in kitchens that operate like factories, producing thousands of portions of food that will be consumed in 15-minute windows. 6 o'clock, the first count of the day, when every person in every cell must be accounted for, their presence verified by guards who move systematically through the tiers, checking faces against photographs. marking names on lists that will be tallied and compared and filed in offices where no one reads them. Time moves differently inside the complex. Minutes stretch like hours during the long waits between meals, between showers, between the brief periods when inmates are allowed to leave their cells and move through the corridors under the watchful eyes of correctional officers. Hours compress into seconds during the chaos of shift changes, when one set of guards hands responsibility to another in hurried conversations filled with warnings about which inmates require special attention, which units are experiencing tension, which systems are functioning properly, and which are beginning to fail. The count is everything. Every few hours, all movement stops while guards verify that every person assigned to every cell is present and accounted for. Inmates stand at their doors, faces visible through the narrow windows, while officers mark their attendance on clipboards that have remained essentially unchanged since the facility opened. If someone is missing, moved to court, transferred to a hospital, or simply miscounted during the previous tally, the entire division locks down until the discrepancy is resolved. These lockdowns can last minutes or hours, depending on how quickly the missing person can be located. During a lockdown, no one moves. Meals are delayed. Medical appointments are postponed. Legal visits are canceled. The entire complex, with all its industrial efficiency and modern design, can be brought to a standstill by a single clerical error or a guard who counted incorrectly. The ripple effects of delays compound throughout the day. A late breakfast means a rushed lunch. A delayed count means missed court appearances. A medical emergency that requires additional security can back up movement schedules for hours, creating a cascade of missed appointments and postponed activities that will not be rescheduled until the following day or the day after that, or sometimes not at all. The physical plant itself imposes its own constraints. Despite being designed for efficiency, the jail relies heavily on manual systems that seemed logical during the planning phase but prove cumbersome in daily operation. Doors that could have been automated instead require keys. Thousands of keys, each specific to particular locks, each carried by guards whose key rings grow heavier with each additional area of responsibility. A single guard might carry keys for cell doors, supply rooms, medication lockers, office spaces, and emergency exits. The weight of these keys becomes a physical burden that guards feel in their lower backs and shoulders after years of carrying them through endless shifts. The locks themselves are mechanical marvels and mechanical nightmares. Each one is precisely machined, designed to withstand tremendous force and resist tampering. But precision comes at the cost of speed. In an emergency, when seconds matter, a guard must find the correct key among dozens, insert it properly, turn it the right direction, and hope that years of use have not worn the mechanism beyond reliable function. During the most critical moments, when control of the facility depends on rapid response, the system slows to the pace of human fingers manipulating small pieces of metal. Sound becomes a weapon inside the complex. The architects had calculated that 8-inch concrete walls would provide adequate noise control, but their calculations assumed normal levels of human activity. They had not accounted for the acoustic properties of 8,000 people confined in a space designed for half that number. They had not considered how sound behaves in corridors lined with hard surfaces, concrete floors, steel doors, painted cinder block walls that reflect rather than absorb the noise of daily life. Conversations carry farther than anyone intended. Arguments that begin in one cell can be heard 3 tiers away. The constant chatter of radio communications, guards coordinating movements, reporting incidents, requesting assistance, creates a background hum that never stops. Ventilation systems designed to move air also move sound, carrying voices and music and arguments through ductwork that connects every part of the complex in an acoustic web that makes privacy impossible and solitude a luxury that no amount of money can purchase. Sleep becomes a form of endurance. The fluorescent lights in the corridors burn 24 hours a day, casting a pale glow that seeps under cell doors and through the narrow windows that were meant to allow guards to observe inmates, but also allow inmates to observe each other. The lights in the cells themselves are controlled centrally, shut off at a designated hour, and turned on again before dawn, regardless of individual preference or need. But the absence of light does not guarantee the presence of quiet. The jail operates 3 shifts, and each shift change brings noise. Guards comparing notes, doors opening and closing, the rattle of key rings and the static of radio communications. Someone is always moving somewhere in the complex. Something is always breaking down or being repaired. The building itself settles and creaks with the weight of concrete and steel that was poured quickly and has been bearing load for decades. Medical emergencies occur at all hours, bringing teams of paramedics whose radios and equipment and urgent voices cut through whatever calm the night shift has managed to establish. Mental health crises peak during the hours when most people are sleeping, when the isolation and confinement and fluorescent lighting combine to trigger episodes that require immediate intervention. Suicide attempts cluster around shift changes, when supervision is briefly relaxed and desperate people calculate that they have a few minutes to act on impulses that daylight and constant observation normally suppress. The intake process never stops. Arrest vans arrive at all hours carrying people who were picked up for everything from traffic violations to violent felonies. Each arrival must be processed, photographed, fingerprinted, searched, interviewed, assigned to a cell. The intake area, designed to handle a steady stream of new arrivals, instead faces waves of people that vary unpredictably depending on police activity, court schedules, and the mysterious rhythms of urban life. Cells designed for temporary housing, a few hours while paperwork is completed, instead hold people for days or weeks while they wait for bond hearings, court dates, or simply for space to open up in the main housing units. The intake area becomes a warehouse for human beings, packed beyond its intended capacity, operating under emergency protocols that gradually become standard operating procedures. The guards who work these areas develop a kind of triage mentality, focusing their attention on the most immediate crises while letting less urgent problems accumulate. Someone who needs medication can wait if someone else is threatening suicide. Someone who needs to make a phone call can wait if someone else is experiencing a psychotic episode. Someone who needs medical attention can wait if someone else is bleeding. This is not cruelty, though it may look like cruelty to outside observers. It is the inevitable result of a system that demands impossible choices from people who signed up to be correctional officers and instead find themselves serving as emergency medical technicians, mental health crisis counselors, social workers, and suicide prevention specialists. They receive minimal training for most of these roles. They work overtime shifts that stretch their physical and emotional endurance. They make life and death decisions based on incomplete information and inadequate resources. By the mid-1980s, the patterns are clear to anyone willing to look. The jail is housing increasing numbers of people whose primary problem is not criminality but mental illness. Many have been arrested during psychiatric emergencies, situations where they posed a danger to themselves or others, not because they were violent criminals, but because they were experiencing symptoms of diseases they did not understand and could not control. The cycle becomes predictable. Someone with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder stops taking medication, either because they cannot afford it or because the side effects make life unbearable. Their behavior becomes erratic. Family members call police because they do not know what else to do. Police officers, trained to respond to crimes rather than medical emergencies, make arrests because that is the tool they have available. The person enters the jail system, where they receive minimal psychiatric care, stabilize enough to be released, and return to the same circumstances that led to the crisis in the first place. The jail becomes a revolving door for people who cycle through the system repeatedly, never staying long enough to receive adequate treatment, but never staying away long enough to avoid the next crisis. Guards learn to recognize the frequent flyers, people whose names appear on intake lists month after month, year after year, people whose stories become familiar through repetition but no less tragic for their familiarity. The medical staff, meanwhile, faces impossible demands. A handful of doctors and nurses are expected to provide health care for a population larger than many towns. They see patients in examination rooms that double as storage closets. They prescribe medications from a formulary that includes only the most basic drugs. They make treatment decisions based on brief conversations with patients they have never seen before and may never see again. Psychiatric care is even more limited. A few psychologists and social workers attempt to provide mental health services for thousands of people, many of whom have never received adequate psychiatric evaluation or treatment. They work without access to medical records, family histories, or previous treatment plans. They prescribe medications based on symptoms described by patients who may be too confused or suspicious to provide accurate information. They discharge people back to the streets with prescriptions they cannot afford and follow-up appointments they cannot keep. The pharmacy operates like a military supply depot, dispensing thousands of pills each day through windows that look like bank teller stations. Inmates line up for medications at designated times, receiving small plastic cups filled with pills they may not understand, for conditions that may not have been adequately diagnosed, in dosages that may not be appropriate for their individual needs. The process is efficient, but not necessarily therapeutic. Mental health crises increase during the winter months, when heating systems struggle to warm the vast interior spaces of the complex. The cells, designed for temperate climates, become uncomfortably cold when Chicago wind finds its way through gaps in the aging concrete and steel. Inmates stuff newspapers and clothing into cracks around windows and doors, creating fire hazards that guards must constantly monitor and remove. Summer brings different problems. The ventilation systems, adequate when the building was new, struggle to cool the interior when temperatures outside climb into the 90s and hundreds. Heat rises through the tiers, concentrating in the upper levels where the temperature can be 15 or 20 degrees higher than outside. Tempers rise with the temperature. Small disputes escalate into fights. Mental health crises multiply. The staff feels the effects as well. Guards work in uniforms designed for professional appearance rather than comfort, carrying equipment that adds weight and bulk in spaces that offer little opportunity for relief from heat or cold. Over time, shifts become endurance tests. Sick days increase. Turnover accelerates as experienced officers leave for other jobs, and new hires discover that the reality of working in the jail bears little resemblance to what they expected. Training programs designed for conventional correctional work prove inadequate for the mental health facility the jail has become. New guards learn to manage locks and keys, to write reports and follow protocols, to maintain security and order. But they do not learn to recognize the signs of psychiatric deterioration, to de-escalate situations involving mentally ill inmates, or to distinguish between behavioral problems and medical emergencies. They learn through experience, guided by senior officers who themselves learned through experience, creating an informal knowledge base that is never written down and often lost when experienced staff members retire or transfer to other positions. Each shift develops its own culture, its own methods for handling difficult situations, its own understanding of which rules can be bent and which must be enforced without exception. The administrative offices that oversee the complex operate in a different world from the housing units where guards and inmates negotiate the daily realities of confinement. Reports flow upward through chains of command that filter and summarize and sanitize information until it arrives at decision-makers' desks in forms that bear little resemblance to the chaos and complexity of life inside the tiers. Budget meetings focus on cost per inmate per day, efficiency ratios, and staffing formulas that reduce human suffering to mathematical equations. Strategic planning sessions discuss capacity utilization, recidivism rates, and operational metrics that capture the mechanics of incarceration but not its human cost. The language of administration becomes a barrier to understanding, creating distance between those who make policy and those who live with its consequences. Federal and state inspectors visit regularly, examining compliance with regulations that govern everything from food service to medical care to suicide prevention. They arrive with checklists and clipboards, measuring square footage and counting supplies and reviewing documentation. They interview staff members who know which answers are expected and inmates who have learned that complaints can lead to retaliation. The inspections produce reports that identify deficiencies and recommend improvements. The deficiencies are cataloged and prioritized and addressed through action plans that promise future compliance. The improvements are implemented when funding allows and staff time permits and competing priorities do not intervene. The cycle repeats annually, creating a paper trail of good intentions and incremental progress that masks the persistence of fundamental problems. Meanwhile, the lawsuits multiply. Attorneys representing individual inmates and class action plaintiffs document conditions that violate constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. They compile evidence of inadequate medical care, excessive force, prolonged isolation, and systemic indifference to human suffering. They file motions and take depositions and argue before judges who have the power to order changes but not to fund them. The legal system moves slowly, especially in cases involving institutional reform. Years pass between the filing of a complaint and the resolution of a case. During those years, conditions may improve or worsen, staff may change, and the specific problems identified in the lawsuit may be replaced by different problems that require different solutions. Settlement agreements and consent decrees attempt to impose external oversight on internal operations, requiring the jail to meet specific standards for medical care, mental health treatment, and conditions of confinement. Monitors are appointed to track compliance and report on progress. Additional bureaucracies are created to measure and document and verify improvements that may exist more on paper than in practice. The question becomes not whether the system is failing, the evidence of failure is overwhelming, but whether failure was inevitable given the fundamental mismatch between the jail's design and its function. Can a building designed for security provide adequate health care? Can staff trained in law enforcement deliver effective mental health treatment? Can an institution optimized for efficiency create conditions conducive to human dignity? The machine continues to run, processing thousands of people through its intake procedures, housing them in its cells, feeding them in its dining areas, treating them in its medical facilities, and releasing them back to the streets, where many will begin the cycle again. It operates exactly as it was designed to operate, with the efficiency and economy that its planners promised. That is the horror of it. The summer of 1988 breaks temperature records across the Midwest. Chicago swelters under a dome of humidity that seems to press down from the sky itself, trapping heat and exhaust and human breath in a thick soup that makes breathing an effort. The city's power grid strains as air conditioning units run continuously, transforming the urban landscape into a patchwork of artificial climate and desperate survival. Inside the Cook County Jail Complex, the heat becomes a living thing. It rises through the tiers like a slow-moving flood, concentrating in the upper levels where the concrete walls store thermal energy like batteries, releasing it slowly throughout the night so that dawn brings no relief from the previous day's suffering. The ventilation systems, designed for a Chicago that no longer exists, wheeze and struggle against temperatures they were never meant to handle. In Division 9, where the mentally ill are housed in conditions that would challenge the sanity of healthy minds, the heat triggers something unprecedented. What begins as individual discomfort escalates through argument and accusation into something larger and more dangerous. Voices rise in cells where men have been confined for weeks without adequate medical care, without air conditioning, without hope of relief from either the temperature or the circumstances that brought them here. The incident starts small, as most disasters do. An argument between two inmates over access to a broken water fountain. Words exchanged through cell doors. Threats that would normally be absorbed by the constant background noise of institutional life. But heat has a way of stripping away the thin veneer of civilization that makes close confinement possible. What might have been forgotten on a cool day becomes a grudge that metastasizes through the tier. By noon, the argument has spread to adjacent cells. Men who have never spoken to each other find themselves shouting across the narrow corridors, their voices carrying through the ventilation system to other parts of the division. The guards, working overtime shifts in uniforms designed for comfort rather than Chicago summer heat, find their patients wearing as thin as their energy reserves. The first thrown object, a plastic cup filled with urine, sails through a cell door during the brief moment when a guard is unlocking it for a medical transport. It misses its target, but strikes the opposite wall with enough force to shatter, sending its contents across the corridor in an arc that speaks of desperation rather than mere anger. The guard responds by ordering an immediate lockdown of the entire tier. But lockdowns, which work well for containing isolated incidents, prove counterproductive when the incident is the heat itself. Men confined to cells where the temperature has climbed above 100 degrees begin to panic in ways that transcend rational thought. Some strip naked and splash water from their toilets onto the concrete floors, trying to create evaporative cooling in spaces that have no air circulation. Others beat on their doors with whatever objects they can find: shoes, food trays, their own fists, creating a percussive symphony that can be heard throughout the complex. The sound draws more guards, but the guards arrive carrying keys and radios and the authority to restore order through force if necessary. What they do not carry is the ability to lower the temperature or increase air circulation or address any of the underlying conditions that created the crisis in the first place. They can lock doors that are already locked. They can issue orders that cannot be followed. They can document incidents that will disappear into files that no one reads. The heat wave continues for 6 days. During those 6 days, medical emergencies multiply as men collapse from dehydration and heat exhaustion. The jail's small medical staff, already overwhelmed by the daily demands of providing health care to 8,000 people, find themselves treating symptoms of environmental conditions they cannot control. They distribute extra water when supplies permit. They relocate the sickest inmates to air-conditioned medical facilities when space allows. They document heat-related illnesses in reports that disappear into administrative bureaucracies that have no mechanism for addressing systemic environmental failures. Mental health crises peak during the hottest hours of each day. Men with schizophrenia experience increased auditory hallucinations in the concrete echo chambers of their cells. Inmates with bipolar disorder cycle rapidly between mania and depression as their medications lose effectiveness in bodies struggling to regulate temperature. Those suffering from anxiety disorders find their symptoms amplified by the claustrophobic sensation of being trapped in a concrete oven. The suicide attempts cluster around 3 in the morning, when the heat has finally dropped to merely unbearable levels, but sleep remains impossible. Men fashion nooses from bed sheets and clothing, not always with the intention of dying, but often with the simple desire to escape consciousness for a few hours. The guards working night shifts develop an informal protocol for these attempts, checking certain cells more frequently, removing potential hanging materials, talking through door slots to men whose voices have grown quiet in ways that experience has taught them to fear. When the heat wave finally breaks, leaving behind cooler temperatures and the possibility of sleep, the damage assessment begins. 17 men were hospitalized for heat-related illnesses. 34 required treatment for injuries sustained during altercations that might not have occurred in tolerable conditions. 6 serious suicide attempts were recorded, though guards suspect that others went undocumented during the chaos of those 6 days. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The heat wave exposes something that administrators have been reluctant to acknowledge. The jail's infrastructure is failing faster than it can be repaired. The building that opened 10 years ago as a model of modern corrections is aging like a human body under stress. Systems breaking down, efficiency declining, cracks appearing in places that were supposed to last for decades. The ventilation system that struggles with Chicago summer heat will struggle even more with Chicago winter cold. The electrical systems that dim during peak air conditioning demand will fail completely when heating systems draw power they were never designed to carry. The plumbing that backs up during heat-related medical emergencies will freeze and burst when winter temperatures turn water into expanding ice that splits pipes like wishbones. Each crisis reveals new vulnerabilities, and each vulnerability becomes a target for the inexorable forces of entropy that attack institutional infrastructure. Windows develop stress fractures from thermal expansion and contraction. Concrete walls develop hairline cracks that widen imperceptibly each year, allowing moisture to penetrate and freeze and expand until the cracks become visible, then problematic, then dangerous. The locks that seemed so permanent during the ribbon-cutting ceremony are beginning to show their age. Mechanisms that were precisely machined now wobble with wear. Keys that once turned smoothly now require force that tired guards apply incorrectly, causing additional wear that accelerates the degradation. Electronic systems that were state-of-the-art in the late 1970s now require replacement parts that are no longer manufactured, forcing maintenance crews to cannibalize working systems to keep critical systems operational. The administrative response follows predictable patterns. Reports are commissioned to document the problems. Consultants are hired to recommend solutions. Budget meetings are held to prioritize repairs. But the gap between identifying problems and fixing them grows wider each year as the pace of decay accelerates and the resources available for maintenance remain constant or decline. Meanwhile, the fundamental mismatch between the jail's design and its function becomes more apparent each year. The facility that was built to house criminals temporarily is instead housing the mentally ill indefinitely. The medical facilities that were designed to treat injuries and manage chronic conditions are instead providing psychiatric care for thousands of people with serious mental illnesses. The staff that was trained in corrections is instead practicing medicine and psychology and social work without adequate preparation or support. By the early 1990s, the transformation is complete. The Cook County Jail has become the largest mental health facility in the United States, treating more patients than any psychiatric hospital in the country, but it is still organized, staffed, and funded as a correctional institution. It is still governed by security protocols rather than medical standards. It is still operated by people whose primary training is in law enforcement rather than healthcare. The consequences of this mismatch multiply with each passing year. Mentally ill inmates who could be stabilized and returned to the community instead deteriorate during long stays in an environment that is antithetical to mental health. Guards who signed up to work in corrections find themselves managing psychiatric emergencies for which they have received no training. Medical staff who thought they would be treating injuries instead find themselves prescribing psychiatric medications for conditions they barely understand. The lawsuits begin in earnest in 1993. Attorneys representing individual inmates document cases of inadequate medical care that led to preventable deaths. Civil rights organizations file class action suits challenging the conditions of confinement for mentally ill detainees. Federal investigators arrive with clipboards and cameras, documenting conditions that violate constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. But litigation moves slowly, and institutional change moves even more slowly. Years pass between the filing of a complaint and the implementation of court-ordered reforms. During those years, new problems emerge faster than old problems can be solved. Each settlement agreement or consent decree addresses specific deficiencies while leaving the underlying structural problems intact. The media attention that accompanies these lawsuits briefly illuminates conditions inside the jail, but public attention spans are short and other crises soon compete for headlines. Reporters interview inmates who describe sleeping on concrete floors and waiting weeks for psychiatric medications. They photograph overcrowded cells and broken plumbing and walls stained with bodily fluids that cleaning crews cannot completely remove. But the stories focus on individual tragedies rather than systemic failures. They document specific incidents rather than structural problems. They call for reform rather than fundamental reconsideration of whether a jail can ever provide adequate mental health treatment. The coverage generates outrage, but not understanding, sympathy, but not solutions. The political response follows equally predictable patterns. Officials promise investigations and reforms. Additional funding is allocated for specific improvements. New policies are implemented to address documented deficiencies. But the underlying assumptions that created the problem, that mental illness can be managed through incarceration, that efficiency is more important than humanity, that security can substitute for healthcare, remain unchanged. The jail continues to operate, processing thousands of people through its intake procedures, housing them in its deteriorating cells, treating them in its inadequate medical facilities, and releasing them back to the streets where many will begin the cycle again. It operates exactly as it was designed to operate, with the efficiency that was promised and the economy that was demanded. But it no longer operates as a jail in any meaningful sense. It has become something unprecedented in American history. A massive mental health facility that operates under the legal framework of a correctional institution. It has become a place where sick people are housed with criminals, where medical treatment is provided by guards, where healing is expected to occur in conditions designed for punishment. The machine is running perfectly. That is the source of the suffering. The winter of 1994 tests every system in the complex beyond its design limits. Chicago experiences the coldest temperatures in 50 years, with wind chills that make breathing painful and exposed skin dangerous. The city's infrastructure, power grids designed for moderate climates, water systems that were never expected to handle prolonged sub-zero temperatures, begins to fail in ways that reveal the fragility of urban civilization. Inside the jail, the aging heating systems struggle against cold that penetrates the concrete walls like a slow invasion. The cells that were uncomfortably warm during summer heat waves become uncomfortably cold during winter blizzards. Men sleep fully clothed under thin blankets that were never designed to provide warmth in unheated spaces. They wake with frost on the small windows of their cells, ice crystals that form from their own breath, condensing on glass that has become as cold as the outside air. The plumbing fails first. Water lines that run through unheated corridors freeze and burst, flooding areas that cannot be quickly dried in sub-zero temperatures. The flooding creates ice slicks in corridors where guards must walk, turning routine movement into hazardous navigation. Repair crews work in conditions that make their tools difficult to hold and their materials brittle with cold. Toilets and sinks in individual cells freeze when heating systems cannot keep up with demand. Men find themselves confined in spaces without running water, relying on guards to provide drinking water and access to functioning restrooms elsewhere in the complex. But guard staffing has been reduced during budget cuts, and those guards who remain must prioritize security over convenience, medical emergencies over maintenance problems. The cold affects more than plumbing. Electronic locks become unreliable as metal contracts and mechanisms that were precisely calibrated begin to bind. Keys that turn smoothly in temperate conditions require force that tired guards apply clumsily, sometimes breaking keys in locks that must then be drilled out and replaced. Door seals that were meant to provide security instead allow cold air to penetrate cells where men huddle under whatever covering they can improvise. Mental health crises multiply during the coldest weeks. The combination of physical discomfort, social isolation, and environmental stress triggers psychiatric emergencies in people whose mental illnesses were previously stable. Depression deepens among inmates who can see their own breath inside their cells. Anxiety disorders amplify among men who must choose between staying warm under blankets and maintaining the minimal personal hygiene that institutional life permits. The medical staff faces impossible demands during the cold snap. Hypothermia cases arrive in the medical unit, where space heaters create fire hazards in facilities that were never designed for auxiliary heating. Respiratory infections spread through overcrowded housing units, where men breathe the same recycled air for weeks at a time. Frostbite affects inmates whose cells face north, where windows that cannot be properly sealed allow wind-driven cold to penetrate spaces that were supposed to provide shelter. Food service becomes a logistical nightmare when kitchen equipment breaks down in unheated preparation areas. Meals that were nutritionally inadequate under normal conditions become completely insufficient for men whose bodies are burning additional calories to maintain body temperature. Hot drinks become precious commodities, hoarded and traded and fought over in ways that create additional security problems for guards who are already stretched beyond their capacity. The staffing crisis that has been developing for years reaches a breaking point during the cold snap. Guards call in sick rather than work overtime shifts in unheated areas of the complex. Those who do report for duty find themselves managing larger areas with fewer colleagues, making individual safety checks less frequent and emergency responses less coordinated. The administrative staff that normally oversees daily operations works from heated offices, while line staff endures conditions that violate labor standards in any other workplace. But the guards who remain develop an informal culture of mutual support that exists outside official channels. They share coffee and information, cover each other's sections during breaks, and maintain communication networks that function when official radio systems fail in the cold. They learn which heating systems can be jury-rigged to provide additional warmth, and which electrical circuits can handle auxiliary heaters without tripping breakers. The inmates develop their own survival strategies. Men who were enemies under normal conditions share body heat and blankets when temperatures drop low enough to make survival more important than pride. They stuff newspapers and clothing into window frames and door cracks, creating insulation that violates fire codes but provides warmth that keeps them alive through nights when the official heating systems fail completely. They learn to exercise in their cells to generate body heat, developing routines of calisthenics and isometric exercises that can be performed in spaces designed for storage rather than movement. They trade commissary items for extra clothing, creating informal economies based on thermal necessity rather than conventional contraband. They develop communication systems that allow them to check on each other through the long nights when guards cannot make rounds frequently enough to ensure everyone is surviving. The crisis passes when temperatures finally rise above zero and repair crews can begin fixing the systems that failed during the worst of the cold. But the damage extends beyond broken pipes and malfunctioning heaters. Men who survived the winter carry respiratory problems that will affect them for years. Guards who worked through the crisis carry stress-related injuries and trauma that no amount of overtime pay can compensate. The building itself carries structural damage that will require major repairs when funding becomes available. More significantly, the winter exposes the fundamental inadequacy of the jail's infrastructure for its current function. A building designed to house criminals temporarily cannot provide adequate environmental conditions for people who live there permanently. Heating systems sized for short-term detention cannot maintain livable temperatures for long-term residents. Plumbing designed for minimal use cannot handle the demands of a permanent population. The administrative response follows familiar patterns. Reports document the failures and recommend improvements. Budget requests seek funding for infrastructure upgrades. New policies attempt to prevent similar crises through better preparation and emergency protocols. But the recommendations address symptoms rather than causes, and the underlying structural problems remain unchanged. The jail that was designed as a temporary solution to crime has become a permanent warehouse for social problems that have no quick fixes. The building that was meant to process people efficiently has become a holding facility for people who cannot be processed anywhere else. The institution that was supposed to prepare offenders for return to society has become a dumping ground for people whom society has decided it cannot accommodate. The machine continues to run, processing new admissions and managing existing populations and discharging people who will likely return. It operates according to the logic that created it, with the efficiency that was promised and the economy that was demanded. But the efficiency is measured in bodies per square foot, rather than problems solved. The economy is calculated in costs avoided rather than benefits provided. Each crisis reveals new ways that the system fails to match its purpose. Each emergency exposes additional gaps between design and function. Each winter will be harder than the last as systems age and budgets shrink, and the population of mentally ill inmates continues to grow. The building remembers everything. It remembers the optimism of its opening ceremony, when officials believed they had created a solution to urban crime. It remembers the early years when efficiency seemed achievable and reform seemed possible. It remembers each compromise that seemed reasonable at the time, each shortcut that saved money without obviously causing harm. But buildings do not learn from memory. They simply accumulate damage until the accumulated damage becomes failure. And failure, when it comes to systems this large and this complex, is not a moment but a process, slow, inevitable, and terrible in its comprehensiveness. The machine is running exactly as designed. The design was the problem. The sound builds slowly at first, like distant thunder or a train approaching through prairie fog. It begins in Division 4, where the water has been shut off for 3 days, while repair crews attempt to fix a main line that burst during routine maintenance. 800 men confined to cells without functioning toilets, reduced to plastic buckets, and the kind of dignity that can be measured in ounces of cleaning solution distributed once per shift. But this morning, something changes. The rhythm of complaint becomes the rhythm of coordination. Voices that have been shouting individually begin to find each other across the tiers, creating harmonies of anger that resonate through concrete corridors designed to absorb and scatter sound. What starts as protest becomes something larger, a collective roar that carries the accumulated frustration of men who have been treated like inventory for too long. The year is 1998. The Cook County Jail Complex has been operating for 20 years, long enough for its original systems to age beyond reliability and its original purpose to disappear entirely into something unrecognizable. The building that was designed to house 4,000 people temporarily now holds 9,000 people indefinitely. The medical staff that was supposed to treat injuries now manages psychiatric emergencies. The guards who were trained to maintain order now provide social services for which no amount of training could have prepared them. The disturbance spreads with the speed of electricity through copper wire. From Division 4 to Division 3, where men with serious mental illnesses have been waiting weeks for psychiatric evaluations. To Division 7, where pretrial detainees have been held for months without access to adequate legal representation. To Division 9, where the heat still doesn't work properly and the cold seeps through windows that were never properly sealed. The noise becomes a physical thing, pressing against the walls and rising through the ventilation shafts until every part of the complex vibrates with the collective voice of 9,000 people who have found, for perhaps the first time in their lives, perfect unity of purpose. They want out, not individually, through the legal processes that have failed them repeatedly, but collectively, through the simple assertion of human will against institutional machinery. The response is swift and overwhelming. Guards from every division converge on the affected areas, their radios crackling with coordinates and status reports and requests for additional personnel. The Cook County Sheriff's Department dispatches emergency response teams. The Chicago Police Department places units on standby. The Illinois State Police prepare tactical squads for deployment if local resources prove inadequate. But the disturbance does not follow the patterns that emergency response training anticipates. There is no violence, no destruction of property, no assault on guards or staff. There is only sound, the sustained, coordinated expression of human beings who have decided that silence is no longer tolerable. Men who have been invisible to the outside world for months or years suddenly make themselves audible across 26 acres of concrete and steel. The sound carries beyond the jail's perimeter for the first time in its history. Residents of nearby neighborhoods step onto their porches and listen to something they have never heard before, the voice of the building itself speaking through the throats of the people it contains. Traffic slows on nearby streets as drivers strain to identify the source of a noise that seems to come from the earth itself. Local news stations pick up the story within hours, dispatching reporters and camera crews to document a phenomenon that cannot be easily categorized. This is not a riot in the conventional sense. There are no fires, no broken windows, no barricaded corridors. It is something unprecedented, a purely vocal rebellion against conditions that have been ignored for so long that they have become normal. The interviews begin immediately. Reporters speak with family members who have been visiting relatives inside the complex, gathering stories of deteriorating conditions and inadequate care. They interview former guards who describe working conditions that violate basic safety standards. They speak with attorneys who have been filing lawsuits documenting systemic failures for years without generating meaningful public attention. But the most powerful interviews are wordless. The sustained sound coming from inside the complex speaks more clearly than any individual testimony about conditions that have progressed beyond the reach of normal administrative remedies. The voices blend into a chorus that cannot be ignored, cannot be dismissed, and cannot be answered with the usual bureaucratic responses. The administrative reaction follows predictable patterns initially. Officials issue statements acknowledging concerns and promising investigations. They cite budget constraints and staffing challenges and the complexity of managing a facility that serves multiple functions. They point to recent improvements and ongoing reforms and the dedication of staff who work under difficult conditions. But the sound continues. Day becomes, night becomes day. And still the voices rise from the complex in waves that ebb and flow, but never completely stop. Guards report that they cannot determine how the coordination is maintained. Men in cells that cannot see each other somehow sustain rhythms that require precise timing. The sound seems to feed on itself, growing stronger as more voices join and weaker voices find strength in the collective expression. Sleep becomes impossible for everyone within a mile of the complex. The sustained noise penetrates walls and windows that were designed to contain much quieter sounds. Families pack suitcases and drive to relatives' homes in other parts of the city. Business owners board up windows and place signs apologizing for temporary closures. Emergency rooms treat residents for stress-related symptoms and anxiety disorders triggered by exposure to sounds that the human nervous system interprets as signals of extreme danger. The media attention intensifies as the sound continues into its second day. National news networks begin covering the story, sending correspondents to describe scenes that resist conventional journalistic frameworks. How do you report on a rebellion that consists entirely of human voices? How do you interview the participants when they cannot be reached? How do you explain conditions that have been documented in court filings for years but have never generated widespread public concern? The political pressure mounts as elected officials find themselves forced to respond to a situation that cannot be managed through normal channels. The mayor holds emergency meetings with department heads who have no protocols for dealing with sustained vocal protests by incarcerated populations. The county board convenes special sessions to discuss budgetary allocations for infrastructure improvements that might address underlying conditions. The governor's office dispatches mediators trained in crisis negotiation, though it remains unclear who they might negotiate with or what demands might be presented. But the sound is not a negotiating position. It is pure expression of accumulated suffering that has found its voice after years of enforced silence. There are no leaders to identify, no specific demands to address, no particular reforms that would satisfy participants who have moved beyond the possibility of incremental change. The voices want what voices always want: to be heard. The federal government begins paying attention when the sound continues into its third day. Civil rights investigators who have been monitoring conditions at the complex for years suddenly find their reports receiving high-level review. Congressional staff members who have ignored previous requests for oversight hearings begin drafting legislative proposals for prison reform. Federal judges who have been managing consent decrees and settlement agreements related to jail conditions begin considering more aggressive interventions. The economic impact spreads through the surrounding community, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Businesses lose customers who cannot tolerate the constant noise. Property values decline as real estate agents struggle to show homes, while the sounds of human suffering echo through residential neighborhoods. Schools dismiss classes early when teachers report that students cannot concentrate on lessons, while the complex broadcasts its distress signal across the city. The guards working inside the facility face impossible choices. They cannot stop the sound without using force that would escalate the situation beyond control. They cannot ignore the sound because it interferes with their ability to communicate and coordinate. They cannot leave their posts because policy requires minimum staffing levels even during emergencies. Some request transfers to other facilities. Others call in sick rather than work shifts in conditions that test the limits of human endurance. But many guards find themselves sympathetic to the voices they are supposed to suppress. These men and women have worked in the complex for years, watching conditions deteriorate and resources decline while populations increase and needs grow more complex. They have seen the gap between official policy and daily reality. They have witnessed suffering that could be prevented with adequate funding and appropriate programming. Some remove their radios so they cannot be ordered to take actions that conflict with their personal ethics. The inmates participating in the vocal protest maintain discipline that surprises observers who expected chaos and violence. Men coordinate shift changes so that voices remain strong while individual participants rest. They conserve energy and water, understanding that sustained effort requires sustainable practices. They maintain sanitation in their cells despite the disruption of normal services, demonstrating organizational capacity that prison administrators have consistently underestimated. The sound begins to change on the fourth day. Individual voices start separating from the collective chorus, telling specific stories rather than expressing general grievance. Guards report hearing names being called, not in anger, but in memory. Men shout the names of friends who died in the complex from inadequate medical care, family members who stopped visiting because the process was too dehumanizing, children who have grown up while their fathers served time for crimes related to untreated mental illness. These individual testimonies create a different kind of pressure than the collective roar. They transform abstract policy discussions into personal narratives that cannot be dismissed with bureaucratic language. They force listeners to consider the human cost of administrative decisions made in air-conditioned offices by people who have never spent a night in a concrete cell. The breakthrough comes when someone with authority decides to listen rather than respond. A federal mediator trained in hostage negotiation brings a bullhorn to the perimeter fence and asks a simple question: "What do you need?" The response is immediate and unanimous: medical care, mental health treatment, time with family, hope. Souths, these are not demands that can be met through emergency appropriations or executive orders. They require fundamental restructuring of systems that have evolved over decades without adequate planning or oversight. They require acknowledgement that the jail has become something its designers never intended and its administrators are not equipped to manage. They require honest recognition that warehousing human beings is not the same as providing correctional services. The negotiations that follow take place in an atmosphere transformed by the sustained vocal protest. Officials who have spent years defending the status quo suddenly find themselves discussing radical reforms. Budget requests that have been rejected repeatedly are resubmitted with new urgency. Policies that have been implemented gradually over decades are reconsidered comprehensively in meetings that last through multiple nights. But institutional change cannot happen as quickly as institutional crisis. The voices gradually quiet as participants exhaust themselves, but the silence that follows is different from the silence that preceded the uprising. It is not the silence of resignation, but the silence of expectation. Everyone understands that something fundamental has shifted, though no one can predict exactly what will change or how quickly. The media attention fades as newer crises compete for headlines, but the effects of the vocal rebellion continue to reverberate through administrative and political systems. Investigations are launched that lead to resignations and reforms. Lawsuits are filed that result in court orders and consent decrees. Budgets are revised to include funding for improvements that were previously deemed too expensive. But the most significant change is less tangible and more profound. The people warehoused in the complex have demonstrated their capacity for collective action and sustained organization. The guards working in the facility have been reminded that they are managing human beings rather than inventory. The administrators overseeing the system have been forced to acknowledge that efficiency without humanity creates conditions that eventually become unsustainable. The sound has stopped, but the building remembers. It remembers the voices that rose from every cell and corridor, demanding recognition of dignity that had been systematically denied. It remembers the moment when silence became impossible and suffering found its voice. It remembers that systems designed to contain human beings must also acknowledge their humanity, or face the consequences of accumulated anger finally finding expression. The machine had been running exactly as designed. For 4 days, the machine had been forced to listen to what it was producing, and the sound of what it was producing was the sound of human beings refusing to disappear. The federal investigation begins quietly, the way most reckonings do. 3 attorneys from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice arrive at the Cook County Jail Complex on a Tuesday morning in October. Their briefcases filled with court orders and subpoenas that grant them access to every file, every cell, every corner of the facility that has been operating beyond public scrutiny for more than 2 decades. They are not the first federal investigators to examine conditions at the complex. but they are the first to arrive with unlimited time and unlimited authority. Previous inspections have been scheduled in advance, allowing administrators to prepare sanitized tours that show visiting rooms recently cleaned and medical facilities temporarily staffed. This investigation follows no schedule except the investigator's own, grants no warnings, except those required by law, accepts no explanations, except those supported by documentary evidence. The lead investigator is a woman named Sarah Chen, a former emergency room physician who left medicine for law after watching too many patients cycle through her hospital from the county jail with conditions that could have been prevented with adequate care. She understands the medical terminology and the thousands of incident reports that fill filing cabinets in administrative offices. She recognizes the symptoms described in psychological evaluations that have been gathering dust since the day they were written. Her colleagues bring their own expertise. Michael Rodriguez has spent 15 years investigating conditions in correctional facilities across the country, developing pattern recognition that allows him to identify systemic failures from seemingly isolated incidents. Janet Williams specializes in constitutional law related to conditions of confinement, having litigated cases that established precedents now cited in courtrooms nationwide when inmates sue for adequate medical care or humane living conditions. They begin their work in the medical unit, where patient files stretch back to the facility's opening. The records tell stories that individual doctors and nurses have been recording faithfully for years, documenting conditions they could observe but not change, treatments they could recommend but not ensure, outcomes they could predict but not prevent. The patterns emerge quickly when viewed comprehensively rather than case by case. Men admitted with diabetes who die from diabetic coma because their insulin was discontinued due to supply shortages. Inmates with schizophrenia who attempt suicide repeatedly because their antipsychotic medications are switched without medical justification to whatever drugs the jail pharmacy happens to have in stock. Detainees with bipolar disorder who deteriorate during pretrial detention lasting months or years because they never receive the psychiatric evaluation that would allow appropriate treatment. Dr. Chen reads these files with the eye of a clinician who understands that medical records are legal documents created by healthcare providers who know their notes may someday be subpoenaed in malpractice suits or federal investigations. The careful language that protects doctors from liability also reveals the truth about conditions they have been required to work under. When a physician writes that a patient's condition could not be adequately managed given available resources, she is documenting institutional failure in terms that will survive legal scrutiny. The investigators discover that the jail employs more security staff than medical staff by a ratio of 50 to 1. They find that the budget allocation for healthcare represents less than 3% of total operating costs, despite housing a population with medical needs that exceed those of most hospital patients. They learn that psychiatric medications are purchased through contracts that prioritize cost over therapeutic effectiveness, resulting in treatment protocols that no private hospital would consider adequate. The housing units tell their own story. Cells designed for one person now hold two, with men sleeping on concrete floors covered by thin mattresses that provide no protection from the cold that seeps through walls and windows. Shower facilities that were marginally adequate for the original population are now shared by twice as many people, creating conditions that promote the spread of infectious diseases that the medical staff lacks resources to treat effectively. The investigators measure everything: cell dimensions, air circulation rates, temperature variations, noise levels, light intensity. They document conditions with the precision of engineers conducting failure analysis on a bridge that has collapsed, understanding that constitutional violations often begin with design specifications that ignore basic human needs. But the most damning evidence comes from the jail's own records. Internal memos reveal that administrators have been aware of constitutional violations for years, but have chosen to accept the legal costs of defending lawsuits rather than spend money on improvements that would prevent them. Budget documents show that settlement payments to families of inmates who died from inadequate medical care are calculated as routine operating expenses, like utilities or maintenance contracts. The staff interviews reveal a different kind of institutional failure. Guards describe working conditions that violate labor laws governing other industries, mandatory overtime that extends 12-hour shifts to 16 or 20 hours, understaffing that requires single officers to supervise housing units designed for multiple guards, equipment failures that leave staff without reliable communication during emergencies that require coordinated response. Many guards express sympathy for the inmates they supervise, understanding that most of the people in their custody are there because they lack resources rather than because they pose genuine threats to public safety. They describe inmates who return repeatedly, cycling through the jail because the mental health services they need are not available in the community, and the jail provides the only psychiatric treatment they can access, however inadequate. The medical staff interviews reveal professionals struggling to practice medicine under conditions that make adequate care impossible. Doctors describe examining patients in consultation rooms that double as storage closets, prescribing medications without access to medical histories, and making treatment decisions based on 5-minute conversations with people they have never seen before and may never see again. Nurses report medication errors that result from interruptions during distribution procedures, inadequate lighting in treatment areas, and computer systems that frequently malfunction, requiring handwritten records that are easily lost or misfiled. Mental health professionals describe providing therapy in rooms where conversations can be overheard by guards and other inmates, violating confidentiality requirements that are fundamental to effective treatment. The family interviews provide the most heartbreaking testimony. Parents describe watching their children deteriorate during pretrial detention that stretches from weeks into months, while court dates are postponed repeatedly. Spouses tell stories of visiting their partners and witnessing psychiatric decompensation that could be prevented with medications that cost pennies per dose, but are not available because the jail's pharmaceutical contract does not include them. Children describe visiting fathers who no longer recognize them due to untreated schizophrenia, or who have become so depressed during confinement that they sit motionless during visits that were supposed to maintain family connections. Siblings recount watching brothers and sisters enter the jail with manageable mental health conditions and emerge with trauma that will affect them for the remainder of their lives. The investigation expands beyond the jail itself to examine the broader system that feeds people into the facility. The investigators interview police officers who describe arresting individuals during mental health crises because no other services are available, emergency room physicians who discharge patients to the street because psychiatric hospitals have no available beds, and social workers who refer clients to the criminal justice system because it provides the only path to mental health treatment. They document a system that has evolved to use incarceration as a substitute for social services that other developed countries provide through healthcare systems and social welfare programs. The jail has become the mental health facility of last resort for people whose primary offense is being too poor to afford private psychiatric care or too sick to navigate bureaucracies that could theoretically provide public assistance. The economic analysis reveals costs that have been carefully hidden in budget documents that distribute expenses across multiple departments and funding sources. When all direct and indirect costs are calculated, including court processing, police overtime, emergency medical transports, and lawsuit settlements, the true cost of housing each person in the jail exceeds the cost of providing comprehensive community-based services that would address the underlying problems that lead to incarceration. But the most significant finding is not financial, but constitutional. The investigation concludes that conditions in the Cook County Jail complex violate the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment and the 14th Amendment guarantee of due process. The facility operates in a state of deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs of inmates, creating conditions that cause psychological and physical harm that serves no legitimate penological purpose. The federal report, when released 6 months later, runs to more than 800 pages of detailed findings and recommendations. It documents systematic constitutional violations that have persisted for years despite repeated warnings from previous investigations, court orders, and consent decrees. It concludes that the problems at the jail cannot be solved through incremental reforms or additional funding, but require fundamental restructuring of systems that have failed beyond repair. The political response is swift and predictable. Officials promise immediate action to address the documented deficiencies. Emergency funding is allocated for infrastructure improvements and additional staff. New policies are implemented to ensure compliance with constitutional requirements. Press conferences are held to announce reforms that will transform the facility into a model of modern corrections. But the investigators understand that institutional change requires more than political promises or budgetary allocations. It requires acknowledgement that the fundamental premise of the facility, that social problems can be solved through incarceration, is flawed beyond remedy. It requires recognition that warehousing human beings with mental illness in a correctional setting violates basic principles of medical ethics and constitutional law. The consent decree that emerges from the federal investigation runs to more than 200 pages of specific requirements that the jail must meet to avoid federal takeover. It mandates minimum staffing ratios, maximum response times for medical emergencies, temperature ranges that must be maintained in all housing areas, and protocols for suicide prevention that require training no guard has ever received. But consent decrees are only as effective as the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms that support them. The federal court appoints an independent monitor with authority to inspect any part of the facility at any time, to interview staff and inmates without restriction, and to report directly to the judge when compliance failures are discovered. The monitor's first report, issued 6 months after the consent decree is signed, documents limited progress in some areas and continuing violations in others. New policies have been written but not consistently implemented. Additional staff have been hired but not adequately trained. Infrastructure improvements have been planned but not completed due to bureaucratic delays and cost overruns. The inmates continue to cycle through the facility, arriving with mental health conditions that deteriorate during confinement in conditions that no amount of policy revision can transform into therapeutic environments. The guards continue to work overtime shifts that test the limits of human endurance, managing populations they are not trained to supervise in buildings that were not designed for the purposes they now serve. The building itself continues to age, its concrete walls developing new cracks each winter, its mechanical systems failing with increasing frequency, its infrastructure stretched beyond the limits of reasonable operation. Each repair reveals additional problems that require additional repairs, creating cascading maintenance demands that consume resources needed for program improvements mandated by the consent decree. The cycle of crisis and response and inadequate reform continues, driven by systemic forces that no individual administrator or elected official can control. The jail operates within a broader criminal justice system that has evolved to manage social problems through incarceration, creating demands for services that correctional facilities cannot provide and populations that correctional staff cannot adequately supervise. But something has changed since the federal investigation. The conditions at the Cook County Jail Complex are no longer invisible to federal oversight or immune from constitutional scrutiny. The people warehoused there are no longer forgotten by judicial systems that have the power to require improvements. The suffering documented in medical files and incident reports is no longer ignored by enforcement mechanisms that can compel institutional change. The machine continues to run, but it now operates under observation by federal monitors who understand the difference between policy compliance and actual reform. It processes people through intake procedures that must meet constitutional standards rather than administrative convenience. It houses inmates in conditions that must satisfy judicial oversight rather than budgetary constraints. The transformation will take years or decades, assuming it occurs at all. Institutional change happens slowly, measured in small improvements rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Buildings age faster than bureaucracies adapt. People suffer longer than politicians remain in office. But the investigation has established a principle that will outlast any particular administration or budget cycle. The state cannot warehouse human beings in conditions that cause preventable suffering, regardless of the crimes they are accused of committing or the resources available to care for them. Incarceration carries constitutional obligations that cannot be avoided through claims of financial constraint or administrative convenience. The building remembers the investigators walking through its corridors, measuring and documenting and recording testimony that will survive in federal court records long after the witnesses are gone. It remembers the moment when its operations became subject to judicial review rather than administrative discretion. It remembers the recognition that efficiency without humanity creates conditions that violate fundamental principles of constitutional government. The machine had been running exactly as designed for more than 20 years. Now it would have to learn to run differently or face the consequences of federal intervention that could transform it into something its designers never imagined. The measure of that transformation would not be found in policy manuals or budget documents, but in the daily experiences of people whose lives had been reduced to numbers in files that nobody read, until somebody with authority decided that the numbers represented human beings whose suffering could no longer be ignored.